Thank you. Right, there's Colin. Hi, Colin. Thanks for joining. So just getting started, and we've just started the recording. So this is an event hosted by Local Home Retrofit, and we're lucky to have Colin Little from Glasgow City Council here. And the purpose of the event is to advance understanding of Glasgow's draft local heat and energy efficiency strategy, and help people explore the nuance that is implicit in what is a really quite complicated topic, getting Glasgow's whole buildings of all kinds off fossil fuels and making them more energy efficient. So for tonight, we're just going to do a very quick introduction to Local Home and where we're coming from, which is like we're coming from this from a climate change driven perspective. And we'll give a very short introduction to the context for the LHEES from our point of view. And then hopefully there's not much of a difference between that and what you'll hear from Colin at around about 15:15 or so. And then Colin's going to take us through a presentation for about half an hour, and then we'll start to get into Q&A. So I will kick off the Q&A with some points intended to sort of emphasize or reiterate some of the things that Colin might have in his presentation. And then we'll open it up, and we're going to open it up through a whiteboard, an online whiteboard, where people can contribute their questions, and it'll be a resource that we can take away and show as a product from this meeting. And then at 8:25, we'll summarize the next steps. And the big next step is going to be, please respond to the consultation, which is underway until Monday, 25th of September. So, few house rules: we are recording. So please stay muted until the Q&A. But the chat is open. You can please do, and in fact, introduce yourself in the chat. Why are you here? Are you a homeowner? You work in this sector, or you've got some other interests? And put your comments and thoughts and questions in the chat. But please be constructive. This is a difficult topic, and everyone's feeling their way. This is Glasgow is the first to publish its draft LHEES. And this is the first public event, as far as we know, in Scotland during the consultation process. So everyone's learning from this. Please be constructive. Okay, so why are we doing this? So from Local Home's point of view, we're in a climate crisis. This picture is a wildfire in Scotland from a few years ago, and there've been more wildfires in Scottish Highlands even more recently. We need to act. You know, there's just some horrifying news, even just in the last few days, about climate change-induced disasters affecting humans. It's not just an environmental thing, it's all about the environment that supports humans. And if you look at Glasgow, emissions from homes, the LHEES is for all buildings, but just for homes, 31% of Glasgow's territorial emissions are associated with homes, and most of that is from burning gas for heat and hot water. And because this is, partly because homes are inefficient, and partly because we're using fossil fuels, but inefficient homes are uncomfortable, they're unhealthy, and they're expensive to eat. So we've got an opportunity to fix these things as we make the transition away from fossil fuels. The chart on the right shows that really there's not really been any progress on reducing emissions from burning gas in homes in Glasgow since around about 2013, and that chart goes up to 2021. So the question is, we want to develop plans, but is that plan going forward going to be a plan that keeps those emissions high and flat, and then we have a perfect plan that drops them down at a later date? Or from Local Home's point of view, we'd much rather see a curve that started to introduce reductions much earlier. And this, if we can do that, then this area between the two curves is all the carbon that we can avoid, and make it less, mitigate or minimize the worst impacts of climate change that we'll experience, or at least delay the worst. There is really no worst impacts of climate change. There's no end to how bad it can get, but it's really a question of how bad, when does it get really bad, worse than it already is. So quickly on retrofit, what we need to do to our homes is make them more airtight and replace uncontrolled ventilation, like drafts, with controlled ventilation, like a mechanical system in that picture there. There's other options available. We want to insulate, and there's a slightly regrettable picture of me in shorts insulating my floor. Ideally, we want to use low embodied carbon because there's only so much carbon budget for producing the materials we need to put into homes. And we want to have renewable heating and, in some cases, cooling. Already in Glasgow, some homes are at risk of overheating and need cooling. And there's many options for renewable heating. It can be an individual heat pump like bottom left, or it can be a communal heat pump with a ground source or maybe with an air source of heat. It can be equipment that's individual to a house or a flat, which is entirely indoors, like this exhaust air heat pump on the top right. Or it can be what's called a fourth generation heat network with hot water under the roads in insulated pipes, or some combination of these things, even within the same building. We can have hybrid options that can evolve over time. There's many options, and there's others that I've not mentioned. So that's what we're talking about. So Local Home is a group of householders who've got together who want to start making progress on this issue now, when we're feeling the climate crisis. And in many cases, these are people who have an opportunity to make a change to their home in the short term because they've recently bought the home, perhaps, or they're planning a big renovation, or there's some window of opportunity in the life of the household or the building that means they want to use their budget and whatever resources they have to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We're a democratic organisation, so the 170 volunteer households elect a board, and the board holds to account a staff of 4. And so Tom and I are 2 of the staff. Also on the call is Carmen and Jan. And we're a non-profit, so we're purely about addressing climate change in homes in Glasgow for the public interest. So what we do is we facilitate community sharing, help people learn from each other through an online forum and through in-person events. We facilitate, where we can with limited resources, mutual help, like this DIY group on the left, and we help tradespeople enter the sector. So Gemma in that picture moved from being a plasterer to being an insulating plasterer. And we provide case studies to show people what's possible. And we provide a service. This stuff is really complicated and inaccessible for most people. So we provide a service that is bespoke and holistic and helps people make plans that are appropriately sequenced to avoid regrets and is independent of installers. So that's a service that we provide, paid service. So moving on to the Local Heat and Energy Efficiency Strategy, or LHEES. The government guidance here is that LHEES are about producing area-based approaches to heat and energy efficiency planning and delivery. And the LHEES should support Scotland's statutory targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And that's about net zero emissions by 2045, but more urgently, 75% reduction by 2030. And up to 2019, I think that we were down 38% versus 1990. So the baseline is the year 1990. So we're down 38, we need to get to 75 by 2030. And for Glasgow, it has a climate emergency goal of net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. So it's even more challenging than that. So that's what it's all about. We'll put these links in the chat and we'll send them out later as well. But there's the link to the document, glasgow.gov.uk/LHEES, and the consultation is open until Monday. Maybe Colin can later clarify what time on Monday. Is it midday or midnight? And then there's a link to the survey. We'll again put that in the chat later. Oh, it's already in there. Thank you. It's a long document. It's 197 pages, but 66 are appendices. Small mercy. But Colin's going to give us a summary to make it a bit more accessible. It is a draft, and Colin will go over that. And some points in the delivery areas are still, clearly works in progress. So the document does focus it spends a lot of its pages talking about heat networks and the strategies for delivering on eliminating fuel poverty is still to be developed, and the strategy for demand reduction, so insulation and so on, is to be addressed through a separate retrofit strategy. So this is within a context, and I say that purely to make it obvious to people that Colin will reiterate some of this, I'm sure, but just highlighting some points here. Great. So Colin, over to you. So Dr. Colin Little is a project officer in sustainability in the NRS department at Glasgow City Council. Over to you, Colin. I think you've got slides to share, and we think need to make you. Oh, we can't hear you.
Okay, I should be unmuted now.
I can hear you now. Yes, thanks.
Okay, I appear to have two of you here. That's interesting. Okay. Right, I'm just going to go with that. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. I will share my screen. I can't share my screen yet. Can you allow me to share my screen? Can you hear me?
Yep. Right. Yes, I think you should be able to now.
Okay, that's still not working. Try again. Okay, hang on. I said it was on. It appeared to be on two screens, so I'll see whether or not you're on the next one. Never works quite as easily as you expect.
Yeah.
Go right.
So just while you're doing that call, I'll just note that some people have introduced themselves in the chat. Thanks very much for that. It's please do keep putting your comments in, explain why you're here and what you're interested in. That'll be useful input for us.
Okay.
Great, that's coming through now, Colin.
Okay. Can you see that fine?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so yeah, the purpose of this presentation is really just to give you a bit of an update, a bit of a flavour of Glasgow's draft local heat and energy efficiency strategy. As said, it's 197 pages. This will touch on some of the methodology as it affects the whole city, but won't go into major details. I don't think that's achievable in half an hour. So here we go. So the structure is going to quickly touch on the policy and legislation as it affects and has influenced the creation of LHEES. A little bit on some of the targets that are framed around LHEES. There's a little bit of baselining of the performance in Glasgow, and then we'll touch on the developing of some of the zones, how that's affected Glasgow, and then we'll look at one of the zones in more detail, and then we'll briefly touch again on the delivery. The reason we're briefly touching on some of these is because some of them are still in flux from Scottish Government in regard to actually forming the legislative framework to actually do a lot of this work. So the LHEES provides a focus on local heat planning, and key to the strategy is the reduction of heating based on emissions and reductions in the levels of fuel poverty. And as many will know, fuel poverty is defined as 10% of net income being required for fuel needs after housing costs have been deducted. So focus on the LHEES is development of heat networks, the suitability, the identification of the suitability of domestic properties for individual or communal decarbonisation solutions, and also the tackling of poor energy efficiency as a cause of fuel poverty. So key output to this is the mapping of Glasgow for heat networks and also for potential heat pump solutions. The policy, key policy and legislation that the LHEES has arisen from and is supported by is Heat and Building Strategy 2021. And this was formed off the back of Heat Policy Statement in 2015, Scottish Energy Strategy 2017, and Energy Efficient Scotland Route Map 2018. Next up is the Heat Networks Act 2021, and this aims to accelerate the deployment of heat networks in Scotland, and that's through the introduction of a regulatory system, and it's hoped, or it aims to boost consumer confidence by protecting the customer effectively. And of course, our local heat and energy efficiency strategy, Scotland, adopted in February 22. This made the publication of an LHEES and associated delivery plans statutory duty for all local authorities. This requires to be published by December this year, and subsequent to that, there will be 5-year updates on the plan. So it should be viewed as a live document. Key national targets that it's based around are energy efficiency. To achieve these, this requires the LHEES to support working closely with the housing sector, and that includes both internal housing services, who we're in very close contact with, and external housing groups, which again, we engage with regularly. Heat networks. Nationally, heat networks are to generate 3% of heat output by 2027, and this is to rise to 8% by 2030. Contribution to climate change. As you've already said, Chris, the LHEES is to deliver 75% reduction of CO2 by 2030, and that's based on the 1990 baseline. Also, fuel poverty, it aims to deliver a significant reduction in fuel poverty and extreme fuel poverty, which should hopefully see levels of no greater than 5% and 1% by 2040. Looking at the baseline of performance, from our data, from 2006 to 2021, we have seen a 42% decrease in CO2 emissions. However, when we look at the energy sector, there in a bit of detail, you can see that this highlights that there has, and you've pretty much already shown this slide, Chris, it highlights that there's been very little change in the CO2 emissions related to gas. I think it's interesting to see, when you look at electricity, that's dropped significantly. And of course, that's some way with the decarbonisation of the electricity sector. Looking at those in a little bit of detail, just to get sort of a proportion of the gas emissions. The two charts at the top, they highlight the increased proportion of overall emissions by gas between 2006 and 2021. And proportionally, this has risen from 28% to 42%. Change in the proportion of this, obviously, as I said, is largely due to the success in renewables in the electricity sector. The bottom chart highlights sort of the breakdown of gas emissions. Orange sector on the left side is that attributed to domestic heating, which is quite significant. And of course, the LHEES also covers a lot of public buildings as well. So public sector down there at 21% is in grey. Move quickly on to energy efficiency and fuel poverty. Now, when we look at the energy efficiency of buildings and how this impacts on fuel poverty, again, this is touching on legislation and the guidance there. All homes need to be a minimum of EPC C by 2033, but for social housing, this is slightly accelerated and also at a higher level at EPC B by 2032. Should say the levels given here for fuel poverty at 25% and 13.5% are probably actually significantly higher at the moment from data due to the significantly higher cost of living at the moment. Looking at that poor energy efficiency as a driver of fuel poverty, this map shows areas of low energy efficiency as yellow. You can see pretty much the tenemental properties really kind of leap out there. I'm sure you can all sort of see this area here in the West End and of course the South Side. However, as a driver for fuel poverty, that's highlighted in orange and also in red. So it's not such a driver for fuel poverty in these areas, but there are certainly hotspots within there. The main parts of energy efficiency here that are the problem, of course, are in uninsulated walls at 41% of buildings. And I think that's part of the difficulty in insulating the walls of a lot of our older housing stock, pre-1919 specifically. Loft insulation and single glazed windows a lot of the time have been covered with previous programs to increase the level of efficiency of buildings. But uninsulated walls remains a key challenge for a significant proportion of Glasgow residents. Moving on to heat networks. So the heat network zone process is really to identify areas that are more suitable for the development of heat networks and where they would be viable to take forward. From a demand perspective, we have looked at anchor loads where the heat demand is greater than 500 megawatt hours per year. And we've looked at the initial, and this looks at the initial economics of heat networks and just make sure that they are viable. The demand density also looks at the concentration of suitable anchor loads, and from that we can see whether or not there's any close together. And again, we will move on to that with mapping. Linear heat density is also used, and that provides us with a metric for how close heat demand is, and the standard rating for this is 4,000 kilowatt hours per meter, and we'll see that on the next slide. So what we did here is we took all of the anchor loads within Glasgow. Some of these are modelled data and some of these are billing data, and this is mentioned within the LHEES draft document as a confidence level. So the light blue that you can see at the back of all those is the 4,000 kilowatt hour per meter metric, which indicates what's potentially financially viable to develop a heat network. It's just where the cost of putting in all the equipment and the pipe work balances up with what the potential demand is within that area. What we then went on to do was model this for 8,000, 16,000 and 32,000, and that allowed us to separate out areas because it's quite a heat dense area and actually covers about 45% of the whole city's land, and that's allowed us to then take forward a zoning process. What we also covered were key supply opportunities within the city. So this is identified by the red buffers, which indicate 750 meters away from a supply and 1,500 meters in the sort of salmon pink color. So these include the Clyde, energy from waste plants, including the Polmadie plant, and also the South Clyde Energy Centre over near the Queen Elizabeth, which is actually yet to be built but does have permission. and also wastewater treatment plants. Other supply opportunities within this area that have been included are things like wastewater pipe network, mine workings, geothermal, and that covers deep geothermal and also ground source heat pumps, and also waste heat from things like data centers and maybe the distillery as well. So that takes us to the zoning process. The output indicative heat network zones basically identified where there were clusters that were then bound by either natural barriers such as river, canal, that kind of thing, and anything in the built environment such as railways, motorways, significant roads. These are only indicative at this point, but what this allowed us to do is to pick out areas and then take the heat demand within those areas and report it on the pages for each of the zones within the draft LHEES. So that's really been the function of that, and also they really give us a starting point. Oh, I should also say the green zones within this are those that have been identified as having potential heat sources already in place that would count as renewable energy. Again, one aspect of Glasgow's plan for this is to ensure that any heat sources that go in are from renewable sources. So if we have what we'll do is we'll have a little look at one of the zones, and the one I've picked out there is Southwest 2, which right in the middle of that is the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. So looking at that zone, you can see in a little more detail the buffering process from a point of view of the heat density. And this has been classed as a primary zone because there's three key opportunities within the zone. So there's a proposed energy from heat waste plant, there's a Shield Hall wastewater treatment plant, and of course there's the Clyde. Key heat demands within there are the hospital, and you can see that's represented by a single dot with some other dots around. Size of these dots is proportional to the level of heat demand. From a residential tenure point of view, 50% of the properties here are social housing, and that also adds to the sort of rationale for focusing on this, identifying this area as a primary zone for from a socio-economic perspective. We've also had proactive engagement with Lint House Housing Association on this, and they're also talking to other housing associations in the surrounding area in regard to development of heat networks. We do find that a lot of taking these heat networks forward, a lot of this is being carried forward just now by organisational heat housing associations. Clyde Gateway are also doing some significant work in this area as well. Moving away from heat network zones, the buildings, we looked at all the buildings in Glasgow area. These were all categorized as category 0 to 3. Category 0, and these are not shown, already have renewables connected, so we discounted them at this point. Category 1 are those with a good level of insulation, and they also have wet heating systems, so they're suitable for connection to sort of heat pumps. And category 2 are similar in regard to their existing heating, but they need to have some minor upgrades to the fabric to bring them up to a higher standard. So we had a look at this area, and we identified a number of clusters within the area to identify action areas out with the heat dense zones. This was as part of the instruction at this time, and that resulted in the next graph there. So this has generated, I think it's 37, maybe 33, it's not 37. This has generated 37 zones, which would be ready to connect to some decarbonized heating, potentially air source heat pumps, potentially maybe ground source heat pumps. But this would then be passed on to our housing contacts or stakeholder groups to see what would be actionable. And if we combine this with heat networks and retrofit analysis, most of the populated areas are covered by the LHEES at this point. This area is still being worked on, and also additional information has been analysed on these zones and will be included in the final LHEES. From a communications and engagement to date, this has been ongoing. Now let me say, I joined the team in November last year. So since that point, before that point, we've been talking closely with our colleagues in housing, and also in planning, and also externally registered social landlords, health, education, and also utility sectors as well. Stakeholder workshop took place at City Chambers on May 15th, which was attended by 100 external stakeholders, and that gave an overview of the LHEES to Scottish Government. This has helped clarify our approach, as well as providing an opportunity to gather additional information from the stakeholder groups, meaning that in a number of cases we're no longer using model data, and we're using sort of billing data, which gives us a greater confidence in the outputs. For the ongoing consultation, of which this is part, we've been utilising social media, electronic media, and printed media. So that's included contacting RSLs, community councils, Chamber of Commerce, various media streams, public-facing electronic screens, and notice boards and libraries. How that looks from an output point of view is this is what's covered, and I can clarify that it closes at midnight on Monday. So it will be right up to the wire. You'll be allowed to submit any input you wish. Next steps is moving from indicative to designated zones. Key action in the short term will be to legally designate heat network zones, and that's through the requirement of the Heat Network Act, as I mentioned earlier. So the process diagram here outlines what we intend to do, and then follow that into a delivery phase. We don't currently have any clarity on how this permitting is going to work, but as long as we're outputting an evidence-based map of what is possible in Glasgow, we believe it will be a worthwhile document. Moving forward, there is the potential for energy partnerships. Now, whether that is through community groups, other housing associations, potential community renewable generation, that's pretty much open to discussion at this point. So it's I think there's a lot of potential for this to develop in a very, very positive way. So next steps are, as I said, public consultation closes 25th of September, and that's at midnight. We will then be going to the Net Zero and Climate Programme on the 7th of November. So we've got a lot of writing to do, and final approval will be at City Administration Committee on 16th of November. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Colin, and well done for compressing our super complicated document to such the tiny time window that we gave you. So I'll ask you to stop sharing now. Thank you, and I'll share my screen again. Oh,
has that stopped sharing?
It has, but I've got a problem now. Why can't I share? Reclaim host. There we go.
Okay, that's good. I think I can. Oh, hang on. I've still. Let me just finish.
There we go.
That's better. I think that's
right.
better.
Okay, so I've got. I just want to take you through a few questions. These are basically the comments and questions I sent to you before, Colin, and then what we'll do after this is I invite people to put their comments onto a whiteboard, and we'll come to that in a second. So yeah, now, can you just say a bit more about timeline? Like, so you talked about the next steps beyond the consultation and for figuring out what the designated heat network zones might be, but what in the years ahead, like when could we expect heat networks to being built, and how does that fit against, the 2030 target and so on?
I wish I could give you a definitive answer on that. I think the thing that will influence that will be how the permitting develops, and that's currently sitting with Scottish Government. There are a number of groups out there looking at heat networks. As I said, the Clyde Gateway are developing a number of locations, and I think what the LHEES will do is show a lot of the potential. And from a heat network point of view, obviously that requires to get pipes in the ground, or more pipes in the ground, because we already have a number of heat networks across Glasgow, and maybe there's potential to facilitate the expansion of those. We have a number of very usable heat sources, so it would be really nice to see proposals around those areas, and if those proposals come from local groups, then obviously that would also be a very positive outcome.
Okay.
I think moving more closely forward in regard to the energy efficiency aspects of the LHEES, because it's not all about heat networks. I think a lot of the information that we have been generating, we've been sharing of and working very closely with our colleagues in housing. And I know they're working up a program of retrofit for energy efficiency improvements across Glasgow as well. So hopefully we can see that reduction in demand very soon, and hopefully we'll also get that clarity on permitting.
So on page 62, I'm not expecting to look at it right now, but it does say that this LHEES can last up to 5 years. The government requires that you replace it at least every 5 years. And it does say the expansion will happen in LHEES 2, 2029 to 2034. So I don't know if that was the steer I got on timings for deployment.
I'm not sure I would take that as a nothing's happening until a particular date.
Okay.
I would hope. I think we've been quite thorough in this, and the feedback that we've had from housing and social housing has been very positive. The feedback we've had from Scottish Government's been positive, and I think that's helped us. They've also provided some guidance so that its useful outputs. I think the useful outputs will be very early on. I think will attract attention
Okay,
for potential development.
great. Okay, so yeah, so a statement of intent can often focus mind, so that's great. Okay, so yeah, and you've kind of touched on this, but I was wondering about the integration of demand reduction. One question, just briefly on this then, what level of heat demand have you assumed in your modeling? Is it the current heat demand, or is it perhaps the EPC-C standard that the government is proposing to make a minimum standard, or is it some other standard, like the UK
The,
net zero
the,
standard?
the heat demand at this point, what we've done when we've been looking at houses that are suitable to connect, those are the ones that are already of the, I think it's a minimum of APCC. So they are deemed as already being ready to connect
To a heat
with
network. You're talking about heat network here.
where to a heat network or an air source heat pump. Because a lot of the times, the infrastructure that's required inside the house, as you know, is very similar. So if you have a suitable wet heat network heating system within the property and it's up to the EPC level required, then we've used that to identify those properties that would be suitable potentially for air source or ground source or some other type of renewable. Where what we previously did is we actually focused that on those areas out with the heat dense areas. But I think we understand that we've done the modeling within the heat dense areas as well. So that information, I think, should also be included because I think that's useful information from a retrofit point of view.
Okay, so the models of where the heat density is based on assuming that all the buildings in those heat dense areas are improved EPCC.
No,
Oh,
that's for the ones that we've identified as ready to connect. What we did is we used home analytics data, and that also has EPC data. So the home analytics data was based on where it was based on modeled data that's indicated as confidence 1, and where it's based on billing data that's confidence 5, and the various other types are outlined within the LHEES document. It's within the methodology.
okay, I'll have to read it again.
Then
I'm still a bit confused, but we'll have to move on. Okay, I think I'm going to skip some of these questions and we'll come
sure.
back to them in the whiteboard. But it seems like we're still working out strategies for tenements. Is that fair to say? It says in one place that rather than insulate tenements, it might be better to address fuel poverty by through heat pumps instead of insulation. It sounds like we're just still working out what to do with tenements. Is that right?
I think tenements definitely the solution for that largely sits with the retrofit team. I would say that where you have high density housing, then potentially some of those residences are not really suitable for air source heat pumps just being strapped onto the wall. And in those situations, potentially where there is an available heat source, then those would lend themselves to a heat network.
So it might be a communal heat network, for example.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
So there's heating options, but we're not clear what we're doing with demand reduction. And in any case, that's not going to be in the LHEES, despite the E. Okay.
I think it will be in the LHEES because it is within the remit of the LHEES, but it will be more significantly worked out in close partnership with our housing colleagues.
Okay.
You'll be aware of the project where they went in and they did full wall insulation And unfortunately, whilst that works, it's
Difficult.
not economically viable for all
Yeah.
of the properties in Glasgow.
Yeah, we're working on a project on that. That's okay. That's good. I'm going to skip through this quickly. Carmen or Tom, could you please drop the link in the chat for the Jamboard, and we'll quickly switch over in a second to the Jamboard, and people just follow that link. So the question, I'll briefly put these on the page, and then I'll ask you, Colin, to respond to these while we move over to the Jamboard in a second.
Sure.
Is there a risk that by giving a steer that there's going to be a heat network in an area that's in the future, and then actually it might turn out that there isn't going to be heat network in that area, that we might be missing opportunities for homeowners to make earlier decisions? That's one question. I'll let you bundle your answer. How are we going to engage with homeowners and overcome their veto over what happens to their home? What role is it going to be for people involved in their power over their home in this process? And lastly, is there anything that citizens can do? Can we leverage or empower citizens to add to the capacity of the local authority? So, because I'm a bit concerned that local authority's got a lot on its plate with climate adaptations and sustainability as well. So, so I'll let you bundle your response to that in a second, Colin. But I'm just going to ask people to move over to the Jamboard. I'm going to bring that up on my page. Can people still see that? Can I get a thumbs up, Tom? Can you see the Jamboard?
Yep.
So on this page, someone's in there already. There's a bunch of stickies, like think of them like post-it notes, and frozen on the page are my sort of starters of questions. And you can go and take one of these stickies and sing, and put it in your own comment and stick it wherever you want. Stick it over my stuff if you want. And please just start firing away with your questions and comments. And then this is a bit of an experiment, but we'll try and respond to that as we go. While people are doing that, Colin, would you like to have any comments on those last few points that I've raised?
In regard to, will it stop people moving forward? I think it really depends on what's actually viable for the building. You know, for example, if you have a detached pre-1919 property, it has been shown in recent studies that pretty much all properties pre-1919 as well are entirely suitable for air source heat pumps. I think what you need to look at is whether or not there is actually anything planned, what the early interest is, and what the actual costs were. Obviously, if you have quite a drafty building, then air source heat pumps do tend to work better where they're not, you're not just losing all the heat. So that's your better option, because otherwise it would increase your electricity bill, and electricity bills just now are significantly higher than gas bills, even though gas bills are also exceedingly high. Yeah. So that one's a bit of a quandary. I really think it depends on the typology of the building, whether or not it's actually easy. Is it easy to put an air source heat pump on there? Then if it is, and it's affordable, and you've done everything you can for that building, then I would not try to dissuade anyone from that. If you are on a third floor flat of a tenement property, then I would say there's probably more potential for trying to move forward and speaking to landlords and engaging with whoever, if you're an owner occupier, then engage with the council, make sure that you actually contribute to these kind of events, and ensure that if you have enthusiasm for it, then that's conveyed, because that will make it easier for us to know that if there are 300 people in the street and they are all very, very enthusiastic about something like a heat network, then that makes it easier for us to make the case and build the business case for that. At scale, heat networks are cheaper to run and build than just single standing air source heat pumps at scale. So that scenario makes sense. In regard to the comment about veto, there is no plans that I'm aware of a compulsory connection.
Because
So
that would be a killer if there was such a proposal. That would kill them.
I think Denmark managed for years without any compulsory connection ever having. So I really don't know of any plans for that. There was another point as well. Sorry, I've not jotted that down. What was the other question?
I think you've kind of, oh yeah, and then the Glasgow City Council, is there a risk that it kind of becomes a bottleneck, and how can we empower citizens to take action and leverage civic capacity to add to what the council can do?
Okay. Yeah, what we will plan to do is when we have published this, moving forward, we will be looking to take forward each of the zones that we've identified in whatever form. They might change a little bit in the final document, but when we do that, we will be looking to engage at a local level. So I would say when we're doing those events, then we will make sure that all the appropriate social landlords, and hopefully maybe at that point we can, because it's a smaller area, there's the potential to direct contact, but that's something that obviously has significant expense. So yeah, I would say whenever we're doing those events, then please ensure you take part. We will do everything to contact all the community councils and whatever to make sure that people are aware of what we're doing. But consultation is planned.
Okay, and what about community energy groups? Is there a scope to leverage community energy groups to advance, for example, community, or just owners of a tenement? There are, I know, owners of tenements that are exploring installing communal heat pumps for their building.
Yeah, I think if that's something that's on the cards, then I would say, yeah, form community renewable groups and get in contact.
With whom and about what?
Oh yeah, sorry. I would contact sustainability at glasgow.gov.uk, and then I know we're currently looking at potential PV and other generation around the city. So I would say contact is, whilst it is going to be, we are busy, the more contact, the better, and it allows us to identify what's actually happening.
Okay. I know Jem is on the call from, I'll get the name wrong. Local Energy Scotland, Community Energy Scotland, HEERS, and that there's a community heat support program funded by the Scottish Government where owners of community groups, whether that's people living in the same building or the same street, can get together and get consultancy support on how to develop their own community energy project. Maybe if someone can put the link into the chat for that, just on that topic. I
think that's definitely your area.
Thanks,
that's what you're doing just now, isn't it? I'm seeing one of the questions here: why weren't green spaces included as potential sources of heat, ground source heat pumps? We have actually mapped those, and potentially that is something that we would look to take forward, but it's going to be a really large document. but yes, it is something that has been considered. It's part of the data set that we've looked at.
Thank you. There's yeah, comments from Gemma in the chat. She's put the link for that program there. And so a couple of comments to bottom right I want to highlight. Is there a land grab currently underway? Will a developer who has managed to negotiate with a heat source have an advantage over a community project who has not? So this, to me, like, I'm going to bundle those under kind of a community wealth project. You know, is there a risk that this becomes an extractive program for the city with big developers taking money out of the city, rather than that the control and the wealth staying in the city? How you talked about energy partners. Can you say anything else about that?
I'm afraid at this stage it's not something that I have an answer to. Obvious, anything I said just now would just be a personal preference, and I do think, you know, there's a number of community and social enterprise groups that are out there that are looking at renewables and energy efficiency, and I would hope they would have a look at the LHEES quite thoroughly and look at what potentials maybe it offers for them.
And there's a question there about how can we avoid having extractive businesses running a natural monopoly? So, like, you know, I would make a comparison with the gas network, so run by a monopoly in each region. Same with the electricity grid in each region, but tightly regulated. I don't think the same regulation exists for heat networks with the same sort of consumer protection standards and sort of profit regulation.
It doesn't. That hasn't been developed at this point, but that is something that is being worked on at Scottish Government level.
Is it a Scottish Government thing or a UK Government thing?
I think
it's a UK government.
Reserved, I think, isn't it?
Oh, it might be reserved, yeah.
Yeah.
But I do know it has been flagged.
Sorry, Colin, what was that? I missed the last thing you said there.
Sorry, from me. I do know it has been flagged.
Okay. Yeah, it's on the radar. Yeah.
It's on the radar.
I muted myself because I wrote that note, and it was less a question about how can we ensure that natural monopolies run by corporates are adequately controlled, and it was more, as it actually reads, how can we avoid that situation occurring in the first place?
Okay. So local ownership or democratic ownership, or
maybe I should reword it. How can we encourage local ownership to avoid? It's the corollary of the other one there, which is about you know, the land grab and, you know, corporate interests.
I would say I don't have a firm answer on that, but it would be definitely something to put into the consultation response so that we can address it in the final document.
Okay. So half an hour to go, roughly. Maybe we'll encourage people to switch on their cameras and put their hand up. You can either wave at me and I might see it, or there's a function in Zoom where you can raise your hand. Somehow, I've forgotten how you do that. I can't see it.
I've seen one question there. Is there a land grab currently underway? I would say the answer is no.
Why do you say that?
Because where these are being developed at this point they are being developed by social landlords largely.
Okay.
So that's, you know, I'll go back to Clyde Gateway as an exemplar example of that, because what they've been doing is, yeah, they're building houses that are of good quality and are future-proofed.
Yeah, okay. The specific concern I have, by way of example, is I virtually live in a community that is adjacent to the Polmadie Energy Centre. So, and really, this is the question about negotiating with heat sources. So, if the housing associations or the broader community organize themselves to put in a bid for a heat network, then are they going to be in a disadvantaged position competing against a commercial developer who's negotiated a heat offtake with the Polmadie power plant? And I expect that you're probably about to say you can't really answer that question, but I think it's a valid concern to raise and a suggestion here is that people might want to think about that and include in the consultation. Anyway, Colin, you might have some response anyway.
It's certainly not something that I'm not aware of as ongoing or has happened. We have been, you know, the GREC was built a number of years ago, and it always had the provision for heat extraction as well as power production. So it is part of its remit, but I'm definitely not aware of any prior interest or anything like that. I don't believe there's any such thing right now.
Okay. I'm going to encourage people to switch their cameras on and raise their hand or wave at me if they would like to read out a question audibly. And until someone does that, I'll keep an eye on the participant. Let's watch for somebody waving at me. But in the meantime, I'll maybe give some more, try and deal with them quick fire, Colin. So the middle right, basically this is saying, is there enough heat supply from river source, from mine water you talked about, and waste from heat? Is there enough heat supply identified?
For the whole of Glasgow?
I think that's the question, yeah.
I can't remember what the amount of, but the flow of Glasgow, bearing in mind, Glasgow is a tidal river. So if you're extracting heat after the weir, then there's a significant amount of heat there. And I have heard it to quote several university lecturers that it has enough heat available to power Glasgow, to heat Glasgow. It would really depend on the strategic placement of the heat extraction points.
Okay.
Because obviously, you know, that plays a part in it.
Okay. So, and I think you were talking about other sources as well, in any case.
Yeah, ground
mine
source,
water.
wastewater, water treatment. There's even data centers.
One just quick fire question: do you know is there a waste heat from data center system already in Glasgow, as far as you know?
Oh, I don't know.
Don't know.
I do know of a couple of data centers who pay a significant amount for cooling, and that could be offset as a heat supply for a local community, I think.
Yeah, the question there, is there not a scope for a massive or less piecemeal solution? For example, a large-scale river source heat pump or far more use of wind energy potential around Glasgow? Well, so I think there's two things there. Where's the big heat source, but also the heat source is going to be powered by electricity, and the electricity is going to have to come from somewhere. So I think, yeah, any comment on that?
I think the thing is, if you look at a lot of micro generation, whether it's PVs and PV farms, there's significant potential for that around Glasgow. There's a lot of these projects are in very early stages, but even transitioning a lot of our public buildings from mains power to PV is something that's ongoing, whether it's schools, leisure centres. So I think there is a transition ongoing, and there's a number of projects that are just kind of at the kickoff stage.
Okay. Question, what are the strategies for conservation areas? Many areas of the city are conservation areas. However, this seems to be missing in the document.
Oh, that's something that is currently being worked up between ourselves and planning. But certainly you would be looking at anything that you're doing there. For example, if you're putting in a heat network, then it does not need to be something that looks even notable. You know, everything's underground other than the pipes, which are usually, if you're routing pipes, a lot of the time these are routed to the back of the properties and up the wall next to things like drain pipes. So the negative impact on buildings is minimal.
Okay, and I think you were saying in the energy efficiency part of the LHEES, that's still in development. So questions about double glazing and solar
I think
panels.
that's something I would definitely defer to my colleagues in housing.
It's not part of the LHEES
So
yet.
please, it is part of the remit of LHEES, but it's part of the expertise of my colleagues in housing, and we are working closely with them on how these are integrated into the LHEES so that whatever is in the LHEES is something that is deliverable.
Okay. I'm hunting around for a question that hasn't really been covered yet. What about hydro? Do we need more hydro on, for example, on the Kelvin?
If we can get it in, then
Why not?
why not?
Yeah. Question on the chat about those social landers. You said there's some social housing heat network projects. Is there going to be will the landlords seek to expand these heat networks to connect to other buildings in their areas that they don't own, or will you be seeking that they do that?
It's not something that we have any policy on at this point, but it would, I think, in line with the development of heat networks, if they were looking to expand a heat network, then that's the sort of thing we would be looking to try and show where there was potential for that expansion.
Okay, so maybe, yeah.
Maybe.
Question: how can we avoid the existence of heat network zones to cause homeowners to become paralyzed when they would otherwise have taken action, like got on and installed their own heat pump?
I'm not sure I understand that as you mean they are you suggesting how can we avoid mandatory connection? Is that what that means? I'm not sure what that means.
My interpret if somebody Fabrice, did you ask that question? I'm sorry, I didn't notice you had your hand up. Sorry, I've got a problem with my screen here. If somebody wants to pipe up and clarify the question, please do so. But my interpretation is that if now that someone hears, like, oh, there might be a heat network in my zone, I was thinking about getting a heat pump, but now I won't. That bakes in another 2 tons a year of carbon dioxide until either we get a heat network or they give up waiting for the heat network and they get a heat pump.
We've helped dozens and will continue to help many more households in making a plan to get off gas and onto heat pumps. Many of those households will be in designated potential heat network zones. Why would they install a heat pump now, right? So this is a real risk that it could cause people to become paralyzed, to not proceed. So how can we avoid that is the question.
I guess this is something we need to look at in greater depth in regard to what are the, are there actually active proposals to do it? I mean, what we have done with the LHEES is we have flagged up areas that are from the metrics that we have been given, point towards the development of a heat network being a viable proposition in that area. But if there was no proposal at that time, even though it's part of a zone would only, I think, again, this is down to the zone designation process. I do not see us designating zones until there is a requirement to do so, because there is interest in taking something forward, but that's something that is still in development. So unfortunately,
that's not really the message that's gone out, Colin, because you've put it out now. You've put out 50% of Glasgow's homes are likely to be in heat networks. That's the message that's gone out.
What I've put out is that 45% of the residential areas or the land in Glasgow shows as being viable to have a heat network. And what we've done is we've broken that down into primary and secondary zones because of the proximity that they have to a potential heat source. So that is part of our statutory duty. But what we haven't said is that X is going to be or is not going to be a heat network. That is purely after this strategy and after there's considerable more work done.
Hopefully, I think that's a really important but quite subtle distinction that I think was lost on me and will be lost on others. There's a map out there, 50% of the land, that would suggest there's a lot more of the homes, a much greater proportion of the homes are in these indicative heat network zones. If I was living in one of those areas, I'm adjacent to one, I'm not quite in one, I would be taking the message, oh, right, so there might be heat network here. Therefore, I was going to get a heat pump. Now I'm not going to.
I would like to see zones being developed across Glasgow at the same scale that they have been in other cities across Europe and in America, to be fair. So I hope what we've put out, it provides an opportunity map that local interested parties and also potential operators of these will be interested in, and it means that we can actually progress, because what we don't want to have is a strategy that just sits on the shelf. We want to actually have put this work in, identified potential for heat network zones, and this is something that goes forward. But at the same time, it's not something I can say is definitely going to happen, but certainly the work has gone in and has identified where things would be viable.
Okay, but I hope you take the point that there's a risk that the suggestion of heat networks is potentially going to slow down action by homeowners.
I think it's, I mean, Colin, by all means, give us your answer to that.
But have I labelled it too much?
What could possibly be seen as a question, but I think it's more important that everyone else on the call takes that as a potential risk. Everyone, you need to be putting in your own views into your submissions, but look, I personally think that's a really big risk.
Okay.
Can we move on to Fabrice?
Yeah, sorry,
I think
my fault. Sorry, I'm labouring too much. Fabrice wanted to come back on that. Do you want to switch on your mic, Fabrice?
Yeah. Thanks, Colin. It's really helpful have you here kind of explaining the LHEES. Just wanted to come back on the question I posed about the social landlords and whether they would kind of seek to build a heat network just for the new builds or their own properties, as opposed to something that would kind of connect to the whole area. Because I think the Scottish legislation for heat networks is primarily based on what happened in Denmark. That's been copied in Holland as well. And one of the key bits of it, at least in the early days of the regulation, was that you'd have exclusivity within the zones. And one of the reasons for that is just to avoid the situation as we currently have, which is, I used to live in the West End, across the road from University of Glasgow's heat network. they have no intention of expanding their heat network beyond their own buildings and becoming a heat network operator. And it's the same situation for lots of universities and things like that. In London, they've had lots of new build developments, all with communal systems and small heat networks, all owned by different companies. And it's almost impossible to get those under a single owner who would then be incentivized to connect them up and build an area-wide network. So I'm just wondering if that kind of that reason for having the zones and the exclusivity within them, if that's still a part of the mix in all this, because I know the legislation's been through the mixer a little bit.
It's interesting to hear, it voiced that the issues of independent developers or smaller developers as being diametrically opposed to sort of a monopoly situation, which, from what you say, would in this case potentially be more preferable. I think my understanding is we will be looking at how zones are designated. Operators would have to bid for that, but this is all purely theoretical. Who designates these zones at this point? In the legislation from Scottish Government, it currently says Scottish ministers. So it depends what happens from a legislative point of view. But I would like to see a situation where we've developed zones, and whilst you may have an operator that is a social landlord and they have something serving their buildings, if they're within that zone, then it's a complex picture because there are already some heat networks, and it is something that is being looked at, and how we actually would deal with that out with their ambitions, so that it didn't thwart the needs of the other people that potentially may be within those zones. I think the approach may mean that existing networks within zones can by all means stay as standalone zones. But again, it depends on how these are currently being fueled, because ultimately we're going to have a situation where most of these are being fueled by CHPs, and that's not necessarily how we see the future of heat network zones in Glasgow. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. Yeah, so we're getting into the policy, but it's kind of interesting to see what you, as one of the people who's had to produce the plan, have understood kind of how this then locks into the delivery and the other policies. So that is really helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Chris, one thing you raised earlier that was I wanted to get back to, and it was about carbon budget approach. And I note that within all our zones, we put those in as gigawatts. Maybe it would be more helpful if we could have a look at those zones from a point of view of carbon savings, or include that within the final LHEES. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's great. That would certainly be it's an important aspect. It's the reason we're doing it, obviously.
Yeah. No, I think that it would help. So I'm glad you raised that earlier.
Yeah, and I don't know if you can. I guess you don't. I'm not clear on the order of things, but we don't know how much demand reduction is going to contribute to carbon reduction. I think some, like the UK Green Building Councils, work out a net zero standard for the UK, and I think it's something like 2/3 of carbon reduction comes from basically insulation, and 1/3 comes from decarbonising the supply in the ideal, well, no, in the modelled scenario. But yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah,
I think it would be useful to reprofile some of the modelling based on the activities of the retrofit team, and what improvements are being done there, and what improvements are potentially achievable. And include that in future heat demand models.
Great. Question from Carmen in the chat. Sorry, I'm gonna have to listen back to this because I'm trying to keep track of the notes and the questions in the chat. I'm not totally paying attention to all your answers. I'm sorry, there's a bit too much going on. But question from Carmen there: what will turn designated zones from theory to reality? Is it a case of waiting for investment, or does it depend more on communities wanting it, or is it primarily going to be driven by social landlords?
I think it will be a number of factors. I think it will be based on having a dependable and renewable heat source on tap. I think it will depend on how receptive businesses and residents of an area would be. So I would say, you know, if there are people that are really enthusiastic about this, then, you know, let us know, bang the drum, tell us about it, you know, go to the consultation. And for these locations, you know, we need to develop effective business cases as well to see how it's taken forward. There are a number of things that are unknown at this point, as I said, with the designation of zones, and that's not something that's been clarified. So unfortunately, that's not something I can answer, but I would say the more receptive and enthusiastic there more enthusiasm there is, it's obviously going to be easier to put something in an area where people want it.
Yes, I think I'd be more concerned about the opposite. If you look at the protests against the clean air legislation in London, like the LHEES, and how the complete, you know, the failure of the hydrogen experiment in Whitby, was it? You know, there's a serious risk of rejection. So we're quite interested in how, as you know.
I think the thing is with this though, heat network zones have been successful in countries for a number of years, for hundreds, you know, over 100 years, and we are going to need to heat our homes, and if we're going to survive on the planet, we are going to need to do it without using our combi boiler to power our radiators. So whether we do use individual air source heat pumps, or whether it's the heat networks work very well where it's a more densely populated area. Air source heat pumps are better in sort of standalone, but that's just from a point of view of having your own heat source. I would say they're all complementary to each other, and hopefully we will manage to decarbonize. That's what the aim is. That's the goal. We're looking to decarbonize heat, and that would make a significant contribution.
Rationally and logically, I totally agree with you, of course, but unfortunately, people aren't rational and oppose breathing clean air and things like that. So there are more questions in the chat, which we've run out of time, unfortunately. So we will try and round up other questions, and maybe we can send you 2 or 3 to answer by email, Colin. But otherwise, I think probably the best way forward is people to respond to the consultation.
I would say all the questions that were raised on the whiteboard, if you can extract them, please send us. Send them to me, because everything that's on there will raise a point in the development of the final LHEES. And if everyone that's on the call could please have a look at the consultation, have a look at the document. I understand there are some areas that still require a lot of work, which is ongoing, and that's because we're working with sort of partner organizations. But please have a look at that and give us your thoughts. And if you're enthusiastic about it, please put that in at the end of your comments.
Super. Right. Thank you so much, Colin. And thank you, everybody, for your contributions. That will make sure that that resource remains available. But I'd like to reiterate what Colin's just said. please contribute to the consultation. The link is on the page, or you can simply Google Glasgow LHEES. The survey's there. There's only 2 opportunities to put in free text, but please use the free text boxes, say what you really think. And also, if you find this useful, please support us. You can join Local Home and take part in grassroots activity to complement top-down activity for £10 a year. You can get a plan for your home and start taking action, whether it's a flat or a house. There's information on the website, or you can contact us about anything else, such as bringing us to talk to your community group or your residents or your tenement close. Whatever it is, please do get in touch. So yeah, I think lots of thanks in the chat there, Colin. So thank you very much, and thanks everybody. Have a nice evening.
Thank you for inviting me. Good night.
Thanks, Colin.
I can't get out of this thing.